So good afternoon, Matthew Baird here. Nice to welcome you to this third in the series of e-learning webinars by Professor Amanda Kennedy. And what we will do now, I'll just point out that we do have a Padlet tool where you can by clicking on the link that's in the chat box and then clicking on the pink plus button, you can put where you are in the world. Now, you can also put wherever you would like to be in the world, and then that will sort of show where people are. But this is one of those sort of interactive things that we can use, one of the tools and games that is available. So you can see some people, we've got Myanmar, Thailand, Philippines and Australia. So without any more ado, I'd like to welcome Amanda and ask her to continue her presentations on e-learning and especially with respect to the 3 or the 10 modules that have been developed as part of the first course of online learning relating to principles of environmental law. But Amanda, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Hopefully you can see the Padlet on the screen at the moment with the map. So if you do feel inclined to share your location, as Matthew said, this is just another one of those tools that we can use to build engagement. The Where in the World tool is simply one option. I did demonstrate in the previous presentation that we met for about 1 month ago, ways that you can use Padlet to build engagement with your students. So you can use it as a tool for them to perhaps post some personal pictures or some other resources or sites of interest. Again, it's just a way to keep things informal and to provide opportunities for students to interact both on matters of course content, but also on more social matters. And as we'll come back to later in tonight's presentation, this is yet another way that we can work towards building that online presence, that sense of community. And it is really geared towards this idea of social presence, that these sorts of tools can be of assistance. So I'll just go back to the PowerPoint for tonight. It's great to see those of you who've been able to join us, and a particular hello to one of my former TTT students, Zelina, who's joining us from Bangkok tonight. Great to see you here in the chat. Matthew, can you just confirm that you're able to see the slides?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So we're now going to work through the remainder of the presentation and the final set of modules that this series of webinars has worked through. For those of you who I haven't yet met, my name is Amanda Kennedy, and like you, I teach environmental law. I'm based here in Brisbane, Australia at the Queensland University of Technology, and I'm also the co-chair of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law Teaching and Capacity Building Subcommittee. So, we've already visited the Padlet. Please do continue to log in and post your location so we get a nice visual representation of where everyone is joining us from. So, a quick overview of what we're looking at tonight. Firstly, we're going to recap the final 4 modules, modules 7 to 10, in that series of e-learning modules that have been made available through the ADB website. And then we're going to focus particularly on the design of online assessment tasks. And this is, I guess, to complement what we've been looking at in previous sessions, where we focused on things like how do we create effective online learning environments through increasing cognitive presence, teacher presence, and social presence. And we also started looking at learning theories as well and how these underpin the creation of effective learning environments. So tonight we're going to finish everything off and bring it together by focusing on assessment. There will also be an opportunity for question and answers at the end, where you can ask any question you like that you might have about online teaching. Do feel free, however, to jump in at any point in time throughout the presentation and ask any questions that you might have. So again, just to remind you, the Core Principles modules is a series of 10 modules that we've made available that you can use as a template in your own teaching. Now, the materials, of course, have been designed largely with a face-to-face teaching approach in mind, but throughout most of those materials, some adaptations have been suggested where you can deploy that content in an online setting. And these 3 webinars have focused quite intensively on how you might deliver this content online and how you might engage in those learning activities, in particular online. So tonight we're focusing on the final 4 modules. First, we'll look at the last principle of equity, that is common but differentiated responsibility, before we briefly note for recent or emerging principles which are covered in the modules, and that includes the Precautionary Principle, the Polluter Principle, and public participation. Now, again, a quick reminder that the materials, the modules that hopefully you have access to are primarily intended for face-to-face teaching, but they can easily be modified for online teaching. And we've looked at how we can do this over some of the recent sessions that we've had. Remember, each module contains PowerPoint slides and learning activities that you can modify yourself for your own teaching purposes. So let's turn first to Module 7 of common but differentiated responsibility, used to structure a brief lecture on common but differentiated responsibility, and those PowerPoint slides are completely customizable. You can alter them to suit your own teaching purposes. Remember, there are a series of detailed notes at the bottom of every PowerPoint slide that should be helpful for you to guide what you might like to include when you're discussing that particular slide. So what is Module 7 all about? This module acknowledges the relationship between the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and other principles of equity, namely intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. The module discusses the idea that common but differentiated responsibility recognises that all states are responsible for addressing global environmental damage, but not equally responsible, given variations in contributions to past harms and also current capacities to respond. And so what it is noted in the module is that the principle is of particular relevance in global responses to climate change. The foundations of this idea of differential treatment in international law are explored in some depth, with a particular focus on the approach in the Stockholm Declaration and, of course, the Rio Declaration, which is where the principle was first used. The ongoing application and evolution of the principle is considered, particularly through the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Agreement. And some of the tensions that accompanied the negotiation of these instruments is noted, including how we came to have the qualifier common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of the different national circumstances, which is featured in the Paris Agreement. Now, the learning activity for this particular module has the form of a student-developed quiz, and we're going to come back to this later on in the session. Now, a quiz that has been devised by a teacher is something I'm sure that you are all familiar with, but the concept of a student-devised quiz is an interesting form of assessment, and it's one that I think you will find particularly useful in the online context. So we'll come back to that a little bit later on. For now, let's turn to the next module, which is Module 8, that of the Precautionary Principle. So this module introduces the foundations and the background of the precautionary principle, noting that it's a relatively recent principle of environmental law and that there have been many iterations of it. The materials here focus on the key international cases which have considered the scope and application of the principle. Now, for the content for this module, the suggested learning activity is a research presentation, which once again is another form of activity that can be easily modified for use as an online assessment item. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail that can be achieved later on. Module 9 explores the polluter pays principle. And the presentation here opens with an exploration of the philosophical basis of the polluter pays principle. This principle, of course, holds that the costs of managing pollution should be borne by the person responsible for causing it. And the objective of the principle is to ensure that polluters bear the expense of pollution control measures. So the materials here track the evolution of the principle from the 1970s right through to the Rio Declaration, where Principle 16 holds that nations should endeavour to allocate the costs of pollution through the internalisation of environmental costs, while also having regard to the public interest and without distorting international trade and development. And so the key elements of the principle are really broken down here. Who is a polluter, what constitutes pollution, and what is the nature of the cost burden. The learning activity or assessment item for this particular module is one that provides students with an opportunity to conduct more independent research and investigation. And the activity takes the form of a class blog. Now, if you haven't come across that term before, if you're not sure what it is, a blog is a website where a student might make a regular entry, say an online journal or a diary, and it's presented in reverse chronological order. And they can be used to comment on a particular subject or a news item or something like that. Now, a blog enables students to post items of interest and to then comment on the posts of other students. So we'll come back to that in a little while, where we look at the use of a blog as an assessment tool. And it's one that I think you'll find is actually quite an effective and quite simple to manage assessment activity for online teaching. The final module is public participation. This module begins by exploring the history of public participation in environmental governance and an exploration of the rationale for participation. The particular focus here is Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, which recognises that environmental issues are best handled with the participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. From this, 3 key elements of public participation in environmental decision-making are distilled, including appropriate access to information concerning the environment, opportunity to participate in decision-making processes, and effective access to justice and appropriate remedies. Now, the learning activity for this module uses a case study. And if you recall back to the previous seminar, we've already looked at the use of a case study. Tonight, we're going to come and reflect on that approach again, but from the perspective of an assessment task rather than a learning activity. A role play, as I'm sure you would be aware, is a really useful structure where students can apply content knowledge to a situation and effectively act as a decision maker or potentially as a participant, and they might explore how they can provide input into a resource allocation decision. And so again, we did speak last time about the use of role plays as a learning activity. We're going to look tonight at how you could modify that as an assessment task in the online realm. So in this final session tonight, our focus is on online assessment. So several of the learning activities that have been proposed in each of those modules can be modified for use as an assessment task. So in the time that we have remaining tonight, we will focus on assessment and the fundamental role that it plays in the online classroom. Well, it can provide students with an idea of their progress in a course, which is obviously important. It can help identify strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately it can measure whether students have achieved the learning objectives that we set. Now, these are all very important pedagogical goals, but why would we choose to undertake assessment in the online environment if we have access to a face-to-face alternative? Well, as we will explore throughout the remainder of tonight's session, the online environment actually provides us with the tools to incorporate more authentic assessment. What is authentic assessment, you might ask? Authentic assessment involves testing students' knowledge and skills in realistic situations. In other words, situations that are relevant to their real-world practice beyond the completion of their study. And there are many benefits of adopting an authentic approach to assessment, particularly when we're seeking to achieve higher learning outcomes. So before we move on much further, I wanted to see what the level of experience was in the room with respect to online assessment. Now, those of you who participated last time will have had experience with Mentimeter, which is a great online polling system. Again, another great tool that we can use to build engagement and encourage students to participate in the online realm when we may not have the benefit of a face-to-face seminar with them. So I'll just share on the screen where you can go to complete this. So if you have another browser open, or perhaps if you have a mobile phone handy, you can go to, in your browser, to menti.com, menti.com, and it will prompt you to enter a code. And that code that you need to enter is on the slide there. It's 13967491. Now, when you go to that site and enter the code, it will ask you to rate your experience with online assessment. So not necessarily online teaching and learning, but assessment in particular, where you've used online tools to assess student learning. You can see that there are some options. You can either select no experience at all. You may have had a little experience, or perhaps you may be very experienced, in which case, please raise your hand and I can hand over the control of tonight's presentation to you. Again, here's just another little experience with using an online medium or an online tool to build participation and engagement with your students. But it's also, as you can see, a useful tool to get some live feedback from students. As we said last time, you can use this to capture student understanding, perhaps as you're explaining content in a live session, or to get feedback on other things that they may like to see included in future lessons. So I'll leave you to complete that poll at your leisure, and I'll move back into the slide set. Okay, so please go ahead and fill in your answer on the Mentimeter. So a brief recap. Remember from our last two sessions, we noted that there are three predominant theories of learning. We have behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. And these theories explain or describe how learners acquire knowledge. And these theories are important to know, not only in terms of how we design our learning content and our materials, but also in how we choose to assess students. The theories exist on somewhat of a continuum, which moves from very passive style learning to active learning, and from teaching through to facilitation. one approach is not necessarily better than the other. Their appropriateness really depends on desired learning objectives and what you want to achieve. So behaviourist and cognitivist.
Sorry, can I just you're in presenter mode on your slides, not full.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Matthew.
Okay.
How's that? Is that working now?
Yes.
Thank you. So one approach is not necessarily better than the other. It really depends on what you wish to achieve. So the behaviourist approaches and the cognitivist approaches are really helpful for learning those foundational concepts. Constructivist approaches are, of course, more helpful for when we're trying to have students achieve more comprehensive, advanced mastery of subject matter. So they each have a role to play. So remember that behaviourism sees knowledge acquired from low-level stimulus response tasks, generally in a passive manner reinforced by the teacher. So the focus here is on remembering key points through repetition and reinforcement. It's all about memory recall. The role of the educator here is to strengthen the stimulus response connection. So a really great assessment tool, if this is our goal, is that of a quiz. And we know that the online realm provides a great platform for student quizzes, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Cognitivism views knowledge as more actively constructed by learners as they are required to process what they need to know. The teacher acts more as the facilitator who guides student discovery. And this theory holds that learning is not simply due to a student recalling external stimulus, but more drawing on their own experiences and processing new information that they receive. So in law, a cognitivist approach might be applicable where we ask students to process what they need to know, such as applying the law to a hypothetical scenario. And finally, constructivism. Knowledge is constructed through interactions with a knowledge community, where learners might be called on to collaborate and develop knowledge together. So it's really contextualized by the learner. So we need to keep theories of learning in mind, not only as we're devising content, but also when we're developing our assessment tasks, because the point in students' multiple choice quiz as an assessment task, if we really want to assess their deep understanding and application of a set of regulations to a fact scenario. So it's really important that we keep these theories in mind. The other thing to keep in mind when we're looking at assessment are different types of assessment. So we have formative assessment, which usually takes place within a course, and a formative assessment is used to determine typically ongoing progress. So, correctly where they need to their future development. We have summative usually takes place at the end of the course to determine what a student has learned. In other words, whether they've achieved the learning objectives that we have. There are a number of practices to evaluate the best method is going to depend upon those learning objectives and also whether you want them to develop further and scaffold their learning, find assessment that needs to evaluate their understanding across an entire course. So as a non-perfect assessment task to use, if your goal is to measure knowledge gains in a short term, but if you want to assess things like a student's comprehension of now.
There you go.
Okay, it's taking its time. Okay, so we've been through the different types of assessment and also the theories of learning that underpin them. So let's go back to the modules and see some of the suggested learning activities which can be translated into assessment tasks. So Module 7, the suggested learning activity there is a student-developed quiz. Now, this is a learning activity that is quite easily adapted into an assessment task. Student-developed quizzes must be distinguished from the more traditional teacher-developed quiz. A student-developed quiz poses a very different type of learning activity, where students are actually responsible for devising the questions and the answers on a set topic. Now, we've talked about quizzes previously as a learning activity. You might recall that having a student undertake a quiz themselves is really directed towards that more behaviourist theory of learning. In other words, where we're simply asking students to recall knowledge. This undoubtedly has a very important role to play if we're seeking to assess foundational concepts and students' basic recall of them. Pop quizzes can be easily implemented in the online learning environment, and they enable us to provide students with real-time instant feedback on their progress. Multiple choice quizzes enable automatic assessment and feedback, and they really are tried and tested in the online learning environment. But while this testing is important and plays a role, it's not particularly suitable to assessing some of those higher order learning outcomes. What we can do to combat that, but still have the benefit of a quiz as an assessment method, is to ask students to devise a quiz themselves, which enables them to demonstrate a greater cognitive grasp of the material, and also to experience different design skills as well. Now, there are many great online tools available that students can use to develop online quizzes, and indeed you may choose to use them yourself if you would like to implement quizzes in your own teaching. Why would we use an online medium to devise a quiz? One of the benefits I find with the online medium, because of course one can deliver a quiz in a physical classroom, the online medium provides a range of interesting facilities around the design and visual appeal of a quiz, which can also help trigger different learning pathways for certain students. And it also might enable us to provide more effective methods of feedback. So it's a very easy method of assessment. But what I like about the student-devised quiz is it just takes things up to a more cognitive level, I guess, of learning theory, and provides students with abilities to really get in and manipulate the content themselves. Now, we've already experienced Mentimeter as one method of doing a quiz earlier this evening. Another great tool that I wanted to show you is called Kahoot. Now, Kahoot, I'm not sure if any of you have experienced before, but Kahoot is a great tool and a really interactive tool, because it has the students almost come and compete against one another, anonymously, of course, to try and answer questions that you might set for them. So what I'd like to do is a little fun experiment. If you would like to go to a browser, on the slide there, you'll see right at the bottom, if you go to www.kahoot.it, that's KAHOOT.it, and put in the game PIN, which is 1471525. Now, what I'll do is I'll open up the Kahoot quiz, and you can see in real time how it might operate. So I'll just bring that slide up. Okay, we have one participant so far. If a few people would like to log in and join us for the quiz. You can see you can have some great background music going.
that your music?
It's the standard music that comes with Kahoot. You can change it to a whole range of different types. If we have a couple more people join the quiz, we can get started and I can show you how it works in practice. And if you're in a physical classroom, for example, you could have this up on the main screen and students can join with a mobile phone. But if you're teaching in the online environment, you can also have a Kahoot game go live and have students participate. Angelo, you keep dropping out. Let's hope you're there. Okay, so let's start the quiz. Of course, there's no prizes for coming first here. So this is a quiz on CBDR, test your knowledge. So on your end, you should have the ability to choose one of those answer options. Everybody got the answer right. Fantastic. You're all paying attention. And as you can see, it provides scores based on who answered quickly. So it looks like Angelo's in the lead. And we'll just do our second question here. Here's a good one for you, Angelo. Okay, so this might change the winners podium. Is that you, Matthew?
Yeah.
Looks like Angelo's our winner tonight.
I think I need an appeal on that answer.
So that just gives you
That's right, Amanda. I just muted.
Thank you. I think we've just, thank you. Okay, so we should be back to our presentation slide now. Just to go back to quizzes, I encourage you to have a look at Kahoot. It's a great tool. It's very easy to use. And as you can see, it's also an easy tool for students to use. So you could set an assessment task for students to devise their own Kahoot quiz. It can be delivered to the class live in the same session, in the same format that we've just adopted there, or you can do it in an asynchronous mode, where students log in independently and complete the quiz at their own pace. So again, it's another great way that we can test student cognition, however, at that lower level. But if we're asking students themselves to devise the questions, it just brings in a higher level of learning and cognition. Okay, so that's quizzes as one form of assessment. Let's have a look now at another assessment activity. And from our Module 8 learning activity and potential assessment task, we have a research presentation. Now, research presentations, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with from the face-to-face setting. This is a tried and tested assessment method where we would ask students to come and do a presentation on a particular topic. And the suggested task for Module 8 is no exception here. The students need to prepare a brief research activity on the application of the precautionary principle in their own jurisdiction. However, what the online medium allows is for greater creativity and diversity in how students may choose to curate and present that material. And so I've put on the overhead there one suggested tool, and we'll have a quick look in a moment at how a student has brought together material for their own presentation. So this one here is called Powtoon, and it's an online animation software, free to access, that students can use to make a very different type of presentation. And so I'll just show you what that looks like. So that's just a very quick snapshot of what a Powtoon video looks like. But the students are able to bring together some very neat little animation tools to make a more visually engaging presentation. There's other tools as well. There's Prezi, there's PowerPoint, there's Keynote. Each of these tools, but particularly ones like Powtoon, enable students to really experiment with technology and demonstrate creativity in communicating their knowledge. And as we're seeing our students increasingly required to engage in a digital world and using these new platforms, these sorts of technologies and experimenting with them provide students the opportunity to further develop their both their technical skills, but also their communication skills, along with their actual knowledge of environmental law. So one way that you could incorporate this as an assessment task is to set a presentation topic, have the student record a video, and they could either upload it to the learning management system, or if you don't have access to a learning management system, they could simply use an online repository such as YouTube or even a file sharing service. Now, where presentations can be particularly helpful is in this notion of authentic assessment. And I mentioned that a little earlier in the presentation. Authentic assessment has been increasingly recognised as critical to developing these higher order cognition skills, things like problem solving, critical analysis. One of the distinct advantages of online instruction is the ability for us to create authentic learning activities at a larger scale. So if you think back to doing a class presentation within the formal face-to-face classroom, that can be a very artificial environment. If we're using something like an online platform, a student may be required to record a video and upload it, and that may be something that they're called on to do in real life, in practice as well. So it enables us to really set students an authentic task and to have them really step into that role. Increasingly, we know that lawyers work on documents and other files remotely, so it doesn't even need to be a video task that a student could work on as part of being an authentic assessment. You also, so from that perspective, you don't really need to limit video assessment to presentations. It's also very possible to venture into the realm of more practice-oriented tasks as well. Having students prepare and video some oral arguments is one possible example, or they could even use synchronous video to engage in role play, and we'll come back to that later on. So video is a great tool, and online presentations are a fantastic tool to assess students in the online realm. So moving on to the Module 9 learning activity, which can be modified to be an assessment task. This learning activity takes the form of a class blog. I mentioned earlier that a blog is a website where students would make regular entries like a journal or a diary. Typically, they're presented in reverse chronological order, and they can be used to comment on a news item or a case or some other concept, and for students to each individually have the opportunity to comment. Now, these sorts of forums have a role to play, certainly in terms of just building a sense of community, but it's very easy to incorporate an assessment component to them and to actually assess students on the quality of what they're posting, and also on the insight and depth of discussion that they can bring by commenting on the posts of other students. It's another great way that we can encourage dialogue and interaction, and to have students really turn the online learning space into a community of practice where we have not only social presence, but cognitive presence. So the suggested learning activity, which again I've proposed could become an assessment task, is a blog. And for this one, it's based on the application of the Polluter pays principle in Vietnam. If you've already had a look at the materials for this unit, you would be aware that particular assessment task sets out a challenge with respect to pollution in Vietnam from craft villages and the ways in which the Vietnamese government has intervened pretty much since the 1990s to try and control pollution and incorporate the polluter pays principle. And so the suggested activity here is for students to themselves locate a news source or a research report, perhaps a piece of legislation or some other commentary or video documentary, create a blog post and contribute to the dialogue and discussion on that topic. Now, you may well have your own relevant content here that you could post from your own jurisdiction based on the polluter pays principle, or indeed in any other module. The point here is that students are invited to contribute to the discussion. So how do you go about setting up a blog post? First of all, you need a platform for students to post. If you're using a learning management system, you may well already have that feature available to you. If not, I recommend using an external site such as ActiveBoard or EduBlogs, and there's a link provided in the on the slide where you can go and set up a discussion board or a blog for students to actively contribute to the discussion. It's often critical for the staff member to identify common themes or to categorize the posts relevant to the content. And most importantly, it's critical to set participation goals and guidelines around participation. And we talked about this previously when we were discussing how to foster a sense of community and social presence, and the need to tell students that it's important to engage in a manner that is courteous, the sorts of language that they should be using, and how to engage in constructive criticism rather than negative criticism, which doesn't really assist or aid the dialogue. So if we can set clear guidelines and goals of participation, that can also help to ensure a constructive and effective conversation takes place. But certainly it is possible to set out a blog post as an assessment task. And one that I won't touch on in any great detail tonight, because we did cover it last time, is the use of a role play. So Module 10, like Module 5, draws on a role play from the Gala website, which uses a flipped classroom approach to deliver content before a session. Now, again, the modules here assume that this is going to be delivered in a live classroom setting, but there's no reason why you can't use synchronous video technology, such as Zoom, like what we're on tonight, to put students into breakout rooms where they can engage in live debates, and then they can come back to a main communal room to either engage in the role play, where students have the ability to have the microphone for a set period of time. We can also use document sharing services to capture live what the conversation is. And you can also use tools like Mentimeter or other methods to poll students on what the outcome of the role play should be. Again, it's easy to then incorporate an accessible component to a live role play that's conducted online. You can assess students on the quality of the verbal argument that is presented. And you could also incorporate an element of assessing any written documentation that is submitted as well. What I wanted to touch on quickly before turning it over to some questions and answers is the importance of feedback when we're looking at assessment. Feedback, of course, is important in any learning environment, but it's particularly important in the online environment. And it's important to think quite deliberately about how you're going to use it in the online environment. And that's because in the face-to-face setting, we tend to have a lot more opportunity for informal feedback to be provided. We can give that direct feedback to learners face-to-face after class if they come to ask questions. In the online environment, we have to think a little more carefully to ensure that we're building that feedback in, particularly with formative assessment activities where we want our learners to take on board the learning and skills that we want them to develop for future activities. So why is feedback important? Firstly, it reinforces teacher presence. As we explored last time, it's really critical that we foster teacher visibility and presence in the online teaching environment. And so if we're being seen to provide feedback to students, it's another way to reinforce that we are there and that we are listening to them and that we have engaged with their contributions. Feedback is also important to keep students motivated and also engaged with their learning material. If students can see that you're genuinely interested in the success of both their learning and also how well your materials are being received, they'll feel greater levels of engagement and also motivation. Providing feedback also helps our students to get the most out of online materials, and it can have a significant impact on their performance outcomes in later summative assessment as well. So feedback allows the learner not only to assess their progress and determine areas of self-improvement, it also promotes self-reflection, it increases knowledge retention, and it also can encourage constructive discussion with not only the teacher, but other online learners. So how do we go about providing feedback in the online environment? Well, the simplest form is to provide direct comments to students. It's very easy to attach typed comments or to mark up a piece of student assessment with digital tools. A rubric, which you can see a picture of on the overhead, is a scoring guide that's used to evaluate the quality of students' constructive responses. And you may be familiar with using a rubric like this in your own teaching practice where you may deliver content face-to-face. Again, something that is particularly effective though, and really comes into its own in the online environment, is the capacity to provide either oral or video feedback. And so one mechanism that I've used with students that's proven quite popular is to record a short video of a few minutes, providing the student with direct to-camera feedback on their work, which again goes a significant way to building teacher presence and establishing that personal connection with the student. One final thing I wanted to mention when it comes to assessment in the online realm is that of academic integrity. In other words, how do we ensure that students aren't cheating on online assessment? Academic integrity is often raised as a concern when it comes to assessment online. In my experience, though, it's the perception of misconduct that actually looms larger than reality. For non-exam assessments, such as the ones that we've looked at this evening, there are a range of tools that you can utilise to ensure that there's no academic misconduct. For example, anything that requires text-based responses to be submitted, you can ask students to submit that content through a plagiarism detection software that could be incorporated within your learning management system to check for any similarity. Now, it's not necessarily possible to use those tools to check if a student has actually self-authored the content. In other words, whether a student has utilised a ghostwriting service. But that same concern exists in face-to-face settings as well. So the online environment doesn't necessarily increase the possibility that students will engage in these practices. In fact, quite the contrary. Where we've used online plagiarism detection software, there's definitely a marked improvement in academic integrity in student responses. Now, that goes for non-exam based assessment. When we're talking about exam-based assessments, and particularly those that don't require a two-camera verbal participation from students, if an exam is determined to be the most pedagogically appropriate method of assessment, There are online exam systems that exist where student identity can be verified via a camera, and online exam supervisors or proctors can monitor the use of prohibited materials. Now, we are starting to get into the realm of some very specific types of online assessment here, but the point is to say that they do exist and they are possible if you think an online exam is the best use of assessment. But the examples that I've given to you tonight hopefully demonstrate that there's some really interesting options available for you to assess student learning in your online learning materials. So it's now over to you. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you may wish to raise. Happy to hear of any experiences with online assessment that you may have used in your own teaching, but definitely feel free to jump in with any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much indeed, Amanda. And maybe if we can stop the screen share, and people, if they want to ask a question about online teaching, feel free. I mean, you can open up we've got a small enough audience that we can open up our cameras and ask Amanda any questions. The academics are shy. I was actually going to ask one question. Is about plagiarism software, and yep. What are some of the good good softwares? I mean, if the university itself doesn't have one, is there another one that can be used?
I'd have to look into that. The main one I've had experience with is Turnitin, and the benefit of using, I guess, a system that's quite prominent and popular is that it basically works on having a database or a repository of previously received assessment tasks. So it keeps a bank of those of previously submitted assessments across a variety of institutions. So it's able to detect, for example, if a student submits a duplicate of someone else's paper, that would be detected. Of course, if you don't have access to that, it's possible to use even something like a Google search to look for similarity in terms of content between, say, other published documents. That won't help, though, if you're looking for similarities between versions of student work.
Yes, I mean, I've used Grammarly. I think has a plagiarism, but I don't think that actually brings up other students. I think that's only for things that are actually on the internet. So, and Turnitin,
right.
Right. So obviously, as some of these other issues like videos, what about group exercises? As opposed to asking students to do them?
Yeah, so one benefit here, I guess that depends on how you want to structure the activity. So this is where I think Zoom is quite beneficial. If you're wanting to capture group conversations and things like that, you can use a breakout room in Zoom to yourself move between and check on the progress of conversations and how students are interacting. If it's not possible to do that in a live setting, another possibility is to have students complete a peer assessment of one another, which evaluates each of the contributions of group members to the activity. So if your concern is whether or not all group members are equally contributing to the task at hand, you can actually ask for their input. And peer assessment is a particularly powerful tool. And we find more often than not that students don't abuse it necessarily, that they use it with the intent that it was designed. And so it also brings in some other skills around assessment and assessment of others that can be quite helpful. I just note there's a comment from Maria in the chat. No question, but great info on Kahoot. I really encourage you to use Kahoot and experiment with it, Maria. It's such a great tool. The students like it. And as you can see with that very brief experiment that we ran before, there's opportunities for you to bring in multimedia. You can bring in pictures. Kahoot actually has a bank of questions. So any other user around the world that has developed a quiz, you can actually look at their questions and modify them for your own use. So it's a wonderful collaborative tool. There's some great resources there. And believe me, there's nothing the students love more than a competition to race one another to tap the correct answer. So I find even in the physical classroom setting, Kahoot can be a great little energizer to get people active again. In the online realm, though, it's really very valuable in terms of providing another way of students to give them some feedback on their learning.
And there's no doubt that it does promote that little adrenaline rush to demonstrate, knowledge and or lack of knowledge.
I think it's the timer counting down that really gets the heart rate pumping.
Yeah, and the quicker you answer, the more the more points you get.
Absolutely, yes.
So is there? I've seen people are quite happy with the information, not necessarily any questions.
I'm conscious we've gone slightly over time, but yeah.
So that's.
So I know I've just spotted that Maria has asked a question. Do you give demerits for absences due to connection problems? That's a great question, Maria. My experience with that in practice is that it varies depending to the broader institutional policy or university policy. I think with the events of the last 12 months, people have had to become a little more accommodating. As you saw tonight, my own connection dropped out due to some storm activity that we're having in the area. So there's all sorts of things that can impact on a student's capacity to participate. And I think it's something that we have to be sympathetic to. Typically, institutions will have a policy on it. And I think especially if you're in a location where there are known connectivity problems or challenges, I think it's helpful to be accommodating as we can, whether that's by providing an alternative method of assessment if we know that there's going to be problems with connections, or taking that at the very least into account when we go to assess students. To that end, I think I would probably caution against using live mechanisms of assessment if you know there are going to be internet instability issues where connections drop out frequently. This is where asynchronous design can be a lot more helpful and a lot more forgiving in the event of connectivity problems. A great question, Maria. Thank you.
So look, I will say thank you very much, Amanda, not only for this session, but for all three sessions, and indeed for your outstanding contribution as well for the work that was done, the Indian ETTT and also the eLearning modules that are there on the key principles of environmental law. Did you want to, just in closing, would you like to make any comment about the new e-learning modules that you're preparing?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what we have underway at the moment is, I guess, the follow-on set of materials. This time, not so much focused on the substantive content of environmental law, much more focused around teaching methodology and practice. So we're going to build upon some of the content that we've been touching on very briefly in the last three sessions, starting with things like theories of learning, and also how do we bring that into the online learning environment. So really looking at how you might start to construct an online learning course, how you might deliver it, how you might conduct student assessment, and then how you can conduct evaluation at the end with your students. So it really is looking at that whole of life cycle approach to developing an online teaching program for environmental law.
So that's great, Amanda. Thank you again very much. So in terms of the e-certificates, we will organise those and we'll be sending them out. I'll be talking with Angelo about how to get those out to the participants, but we thank you very much for your participation. Again, Amanda, thank you very much. I think we're very privileged to constantly hear from one of the best environmental law teaching academics and pedagogists, could we be that, in terms of the not only the content but the approaches, the methodology, the engagement, which is really so critical these days, because we now understand that there's so much more that we can do for our students, but also in terms of promoting the practice of environmental law. So really, again, thank you very much indeed for your time and your commitment.
The pleasure is all mine. It's always great to come and participate in this session and to hear what everyone else is up to. So thank you.
Thank you. And so all of this material is going to be on the teachenvirolaw.asia website. In addition, we also have 3 lectures and materials that are going to be put up there. We've had lectures from Professor Ben Bohr, Dr. Jonathan Lillibard and Paddy Moore on a variety of topics. We will be having another one in April, which is the next one, which will be on the 24th of April, and we'll be advertising that at the beginning of April. And that's going to be on environmental impact assessment in the ASEAN region. And I will be presenting that, which is the subject of my doctoral work. So look, thank you again very, very much indeed. Thank you everyone for attending. Angelo, thank you, and Christina for organising this. Again, we really appreciate it. We thank the ADB and the Teach Environmental Law project, which is about making sure that we provide teachers with the best skills to teach environmental law. So again, on that note, thank you again, Amanda and Angelo. We can close the session and finish the recording, and everyone have a very good week. Thank you very much.